This week we'll be working with form data and you'll be asked to validate the inputs so that you can then perform a submission and disable this button right here. Before I showed you the code itself, I wanted to take a second to show you something that happens a little bit differently on every browser. On the left hand side here, you'll see that each warning is handled differently on every browser: Opera, Firefox, and WebKit browsers like Chrome. They'll each treat the warning messages for your inputs very differently. We don't want that, and that's why we will create our own custom HTML to be appended to those elements. The reason being is that we want full control over how that warning shows on the browser so that it doesn't disrupt your layout, your look and feel, and your overall design and user experience. These inputs over here are the defaults for each of those browsers, and you do not have the access to style them. So for that reason, we will be creating our own and will not be using the browser defaults. I will be sharing this article as part of your research for the week as well, so you can take a look at the article itself and have another opinion on why this isn't a good idea to use browser defaults. So I've already begun by having some comments, and this is how I'm going to structure my functions, my event listeners, and my overall logic of how this is going to work. The very first thing to do, as always, is to create a global variable that targets what I'm working with. In this case, if I look at my HTML, I am dealing with a donate form, and that will be my first thing to target. So I'm just going to copy that name, var, and we'll label that donation form and camel casing, just so all my variables are a little bit constructed the same. Document for my target, and then query, selector, and then we're looking for an ID, so I need to remember my pound sign, and always closing with a semicolon at the end of the line. So of course that's not going to do anything as of yet. That's just targeting a location on my page, on my HTML rather. Next, I'm going to be creating a function that will handle the events and all of the targets for this left portion of the page where these buttons are located. So function, let me make sure my tabbing is correct. Function, let's label this change amount because I want to keep track of which of the buttons is currently pressed. If I press on the 5, let's change the offer amount to 5. If I press on the 10, change that, so on and so forth. So change amount with camel casing again. This is going to be an event to keep track of. And now I need my opening and closing curly brackets. Now, the next thing to do is to prevent the buttons, because as you can see, these are physical button tags. And whenever you have a button inside of a form field, it will try to submit the form. The default is to try to act as a submit button. So we're going to stop those buttons from interacting with the form so that we can keep track of them with JavaScript. So for that, I need to reference the event, prevent default, camel casing, opening and closing, and then my semicolon at the end of the line. Now this is what stops that button or these buttons from acting like defaults like I mentioned before. Now the next thing we need to do is to keep track of the value and to set that value. So I'm going to copy that comment there. And to set the values, we need to target the inner HTML of this label right here where it says offer amount. So that's so that we can keep track of what am I currently pressing on, and then overwriting the inner HTML of this section right here. So right under my comment, I'm going to first create a target using a variable equals, and let's call it, let's start this instance the event, donation, target, inner HTML, all caps at the end, and my semicolon. Next, I need the location, right? So what am I trying to target? Well, let me copy this ID right here, and we'll label this amount. So what is the amount going to be? Equals to a location, document, query selector, and then the ID that I just copied with a pound sign and always inside of those single quotes. Semicolon to end that line, hit save. Nothing should change now because I need to set that amount value equals to the donation. So just as so, amount dot value equals donation, semicolon. All right, and let's hit save. Clean up my tab in just a little bit. So that's all well so far. Now we need to add the events and the presets to those events, right? So we need to create another function, and instead of keeping track of each and every button, we're just going to use the for loops so we can loop through this UL and the LIs inside of it. So right in my line 15, I'm going to create a variable to keep track of the presets. Let's label it presets. Donation form, which is this variable right here, dot query selector, and then a target, something I'm looking for. In this case, I know that I'm looking for the button tag inside of the presets UL. But as I mentioned before, I'm not looking for a single one, I'm looking for a group of them. So for that, I need to change the query selector to all so that it returns an array of items. So I'm looking for, just going to copy this class name. Remember, pound for IDs, period for classes, so dot presets, and then I need a space to select the button tag inside of that UL with the class of presets. I'm going to hit save, and then the next thing I need to do is to use this target, the presets that I just created, the variable that I just created, to iterate through all of those. So for that, we'll use a for loop, for var I equals 0. So we can start at 0 at the first item of the array, which is this one. And then our iterator, the name of that target that we just used this variable to create presets. Let me just copy and paste so I make sure I'm not making any mistakes. Presets dot length, and then our iterator incrementing by 1 each time. Now we need the opening and closing of the curly brackets, and inside of that for loop we are going to create an event listener for each and every one of those buttons so that JavaScript can keep track of which one is currently being pressed down or clicked on rather. So presets, once again, our iterator, and now we need to add an event listener. What kind of event are we creating? Well, inside of quotes, just as so, click, and then what do we want it to do? In this case, we want it to run the change amount function that we created above. So with a space, change amount, and let me get rid of the last space right here, and always ending in a semicolon. So one more thing that we need to do before this is physically working, we need to validate that those inputs are being correctly pressed down, or that only one of them is being pressed down before we overwrite the offer amount. So I'm going to go to line 23, line 22 actually, push this comment down, and I'm going to create that form validation function. So function, let me clean up my tabbing so I know how my nesting is working properly. Function validate form, camel case, of course. So keep track of an event. And then I am going to once again prevent the buttons from acting like defaults, because I don't want the browser defaults to happen here. So I can delete this comment because that's the same thing. Stop button submission. And that's the first step, but I still need to create targets to what is currently being selected and what I also want to overwrite, which is this label right here. So after line 23, I'm going to leave some space here just to keep things clean. And I'm going to create a couple more targets. So the form needs to be referenced again because I'm a little bit outside of the scope at this point. So that was pound donate, semicolon at the end of the line. And I also need all of the required inputs. So everything with a class of required, which if you look on the left hand side, we have a couple of them. We have the email, the name, you can see right here the class required. So on line 26, going to keep track of those fields with a variable called fields equals form. And because there's more than one, I need to add the all so that I get an array as the return. And I'm looking for, again, the class of required. So I need a period, space, required. I'll hit save. Now I need to check for which one of those are currently valid. So which of those fields are currently valid? So I'm going to clean up my spacing there, and on line 29, I'm going to create a new variable that sets the validation initially to true so that I can later on override it. And I need to make sure before I write that I am still inside of this function that I'm creating, the presets function, or the form validate form function actually. So I'm going to take this curly bracket, move it down here, and hit save. And then in line 29, that's where I'm going to set the initial value to true. So var valid equals true, semicolon at the end. Now I need to loop through every input that's valid, that's currently valid, so that I can check against them. For that, I'm going to use a for loop. Var I equals 0 to start off. And then I'm going to use the fields variable that I just created, length. So it can only go as far as the total length of the fields and increment by 1 every time. All right, hit save. So now I need to check. I'm going to nest an if statement because I don't want that to happen. I want to establish what happens if it's false, if the inputs are not valid. So if fields doesn't have a value, so fields with the iterator inside, of course, dot value, so it counts for every single one of them. Then go ahead and set valid, which we just called out, to false. Semicolon. Let's hit save. Now, before I can open that submission, let me just add a little bit of space here. So before I can open that submission, I need to create another if statement that says what to do if the valid variable equals to true after that for loop has happened. So for that, once again, I need to look for valid. So if valid equals true, which means if it's exactly equal to true, then go ahead and perform this action. And what I want to do is create a selector, a variable that keeps track of the submit button, which there's only one type of those buttons in the page, so I only have one to reference. So for that, I'm going to use a variable called submit, so I can reuse it, and that's going to be equals to form dot query selector, and I am looking for a button that is a submit button. So only one of those on the page. Type equals submit. Okay, hit save. And then after that is looked for and established, I can reuse the name submit dot remove attribute, and the attribute that I want to remove is a class. So I hit save real quick and scroll down into my HTML. So you can see that the button that I'm targeting is this guy right here, the type submit, which currently has a class of disable, and that's what's giving the crossover when I hover over, and it's also disable in the button itself. So still disable. If I press an amount, now you can see that it's changing that label. If I press on 10, it's changing to 10, so it's keeping track of that. So this portion of our code is now working. Now, a couple of things we need to move forward to are the inputs on the right. So for that, let's go to line 41 here. And now we need to keep track of what is currently being validated and required. So for that, we need to create a couple of targets, also the warning message that will be displayed if the target is required and the user tries to move away from it, and a couple other things. So for that, let's go to line 41 and create a function. So this is going to be our custom function that validates the requirements. So we'll call it validate required, which will look for an event. And this is going to be our first target. So I'll nest it in so I know it's inside of that function. My target is going to be a variable that I'll label target. equals event.target. Now the other thing I need to keep track of is the parent, because I need to know, well, if I click on this input, where do I want that error message to happen? If I'm targeting the label for that input, then the parent will be whatever comes outside of that. So that's where I want the error message that I display to come out of. So in line 43, I'm going to create another variable that targets that parent element. So var parent equals target dot parent element, semicolon at the end. And now, well, what do I want that message to say? What do I want the error message to physically say? Let's create another variable on line 44 and label it error. So var error. And this is where we're going to spit out some HTML, which is the replacement for the custom warnings that I showed you before, so that we don't have to run into this issue where they're all different on every browser. So on line 44, var error inside of quotes, single quotes, I'm going to start writing out the HTML. So I want a label, and I'll scroll to some HTML so you could carry along with how the label is focused. So label, now I need a class of error on that, so equals class, double quotes for the class itself, and then the closing of that label. Now, this is just the label itself, or what is the label going to say? This field is required! Exclamation. Now we need to close that label to complete the HTML tag. And greater than, let's hit save. So now that we have all our variables set, I can use these names target, parent, error to target the elements themselves, and also to tell it what to display, what I want it to occur if something is not validated. So I'm going to space things out just to clean it up, and this part will contain a couple of nested if statements as well as an else statement to keep track of what happens if the error is not there. So the first if statement is going to target the target. So if there isn't a target, then value.length. So if there isn't a target, do this. So I'll open and close my curly brackets and nest that second handler inside. If, get rid of the space. Now the parent without the caps. So if there's no parent, query selector, and an error class inside of that, then perform this. So another nesting in there. Try to clean this up a bit. Then in line 48, I need to tell it where to append that error message to. So where in the HTML do I want that physical error that I created with a label to occur? Now you remember using before end and after end on weeks 1, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So inside of that if statement where the parent sits, I'm going to say parent dot insert adjacent HTML caps, and I need to tell it where to insert that and what to do. So because I've already created the error variable here with that label, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to say before end, you can see the two E's there at the end, and then a comma, and what to do, error. which I have just created up here. Now I need to tell it as well what to do. So what do I want it to do if there's no such thing? Well, if there's no such thing, right here on line 50, let me clean up my tabbing. I need to create the else. And that is going to remove the class of error that I'm creating up here. So parent dot remove child, and inside of here I'm going to select that error class. So parent dot query selector camel case, and then the class of error. Semicolon at the end of that line. Hit save. All right. So there are a couple more things I need to do, because even though the validations may be going through, the submit button is still going to be disabled, and I'm not getting any visual cues as to whether the form got sent or not. So I need to create a message to let the user know, okay, all the required fields have been validated, and also creating a thank you note. And there's one more thing I need to do. I need to keep track of when the user clicks on an input and then clicks off of it, so that the event listener will know when to display those error messages. So right here on line 56, I'm going to create a couple of variables that keep track of just that. So on line 56, I'm going to label that required fields. Equals donation form dot query selector all, because there's more than one, and I'm looking for the class of required. Semicolon at the end of that line. Now on line 57, I need to start creating a loop so that I don't have to do that manually, because I'm getting more than one return, right? Because there are multiple instances of that class of required in my HTML. So on line 57, I'm going to use that for loop syntax, var I for my iterator, starting at 0 on the first item of that array, and then I only wanted to go as far as the required fields. So I required fields, which I can easily just copy from here to verify, dot length, semicolon, and then up by 1 each time. Now I need something to happen inside of that for loop, so don't forget your opening and closing of your curly brackets. And in here in lines 58 and 59, I'm going to keep track of both the blur and the input itself. So in other words, if I click on an input, that's the focus of the input, and if I click off of it, that's the blur. So lines 58, I'm going to nest it inside a little bit. Required fields dot with the iterator, because I'm going through an array of items, add event listener. So that's going to add an event listener for each return that I get. And I'm looking for the input specifically, so I can use that function that I've created up here called validate form. Now at the end of that line, as always, semicolon, and the last thing I'm looking for here to add another listener is to the blurred state of that button. So in line 59, required fields iterator dot add event listener, and this time I'm looking for a blur and passing the validation required function. Validation capital R required, or validate required actually. There we go. Capital R. Hit save. And don't forget the semicolon at the end of the line. All right, so there are only a couple last things to do. I'm going to space this out just a bit. And in line 64, I'm going to once again create a function that prevents the buttons from acting out as their default unless I want them to. So I'm going to nest all of my code in here. Function, and I'm going to call this function send, because this is what I wanted to happen if all of those checks that I've been writing do clear. So the event opening and closing. Now I'm going to just simply move this comment up here, and I'm going to say event stop acting like your default. So prevent default, opening and closing, and semicolon at the end. So now I need to create targets for my form, and I also need to create a little bit of HTML so that my error messages have something to spit out, because currently they do not. So line 67, just to have a little bit more space here, I'm going to create those two variables, var form to target the form itself, document query selector, and I only have one form, which was called donate, if I remember correctly. Yes, it is. So I'm going to copy that name, pound for an ID, donate, and semicolon at the end of the line. And the other thing I said I was going to create was a variable that spits out a little bit of HTML with a warning message, because we don't have it yet. So on line 68, var message, for lack of a better name. You can call this whatever you'd like, of course. Now some HTML inside of here. So for that, I'll use two tags that I know you know how to create. It's an h2 tag and a paragraph tag, very simply. So the h2 opens and closes, and inside of that I'm going to say thank you, and outside of that h2 tag I'm going to open a paragraph tag and close it. And what I want the paragraph to say is something like, "You're so awesome. Sharks love you." Hit save. So I have my form selected. I have a variable that keeps track of it, and I also have another variable that creates that error message, or creates a thank you note rather, when the form has been submitted. And I need to append that to something. I need to target something. So on line 70 here, I'm going to say var target equals event.target semicolon at the end. And also I need to look for the disable button so that I can enable it if all of those checks run green. If everything is validated, I need to enable this button to allow the form to be submitted. So var disable equals target class list, capital L, contains disable. So in other words, does this target contain the class of disable inside of it? Oops, with the D, disable. Because it has been disabled. So var disabled target class list contains disabled. And I'm looking for that specific class. So that's all well and done. One more thing I need to do is to check if that disabled target that I just created is absolutely equals to false. So here on line 73, I'm going to create an if statement that keeps track of that. So if disable, 3 equal signs, is false, then perform an option. So opening and closing. Then if that runs, inside of the form, go ahead and spit out the following HTML, which is the message right here that I just created containing that H2 and paragraph tags. So one last thing I need to do outside of that is to actually submit the form, because if I don't, these two lines won't get run. I won't see this message appearing on the screen. So for that, create a variable called var submit equals donation form, camel casing, query selector, and I'm looking for, once again, that button with the type of submit, which there's only one of those instances on the page, so I don't have to create all. Type equals submit. So I'm only looking for one of those. And last but not least, on the last line here, I need to submit the form. So actually call out my send function up here. So submit dot add event listener, and then this is going to be a click event, and I'm looking for my send function. So let's hit save, and now you can see as I refresh this page that if I click on one of these buttons, it updates the label. And let me make my screen a bit bigger. If I click on one of the fields and click off of them, that error warning comes up on the right hand side. If I fill in the fields, phone number, the submit button becomes available. And if I click on it, it shows that thank you message that I created at the very end right here with an H2 and a paragraph tag. So you won't be creating something this complex this week. You only have a couple of fields to play with, and I hope you have fun this week. This is a really cool thing to have in your portfolio. So have a blast with it, theme it, make it your own.